The courtroom was filled with a heavy tension. As everyone's attention turned toward Dorian, the boy who had just uttered two words that shook the entire room. His voice echoed clearly, and in that instant, the atmosphere seemed to freeze. Judge Isabella Reed, known for her poise and unwavering authority, stood motionless at the bench. Her hand, usually firm as she held the gavel, now trembled slightly. "You don't know, do you?" Dorian's words sliced through the silence, sharp and clear. A stunned expression crossed Judge Reed's face as she blinked rapidly, her usual composure crumbling for the first time. The room was deathly quiet. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the next move. Judge Reed's face, once full of control and confidence, was now drained of color, pale as a ghost. What had Dorian said? What was it that could rattle even the unshakable Judge Reed? The audience in the courtroom whispered among themselves, trying to make sense of the unsettling moment. Dorian, barely into his teenage years, stood in front of the judge as if nothing was amiss. His hoodie was oversized, his sneakers slightly scuffed, but his presence in the courtroom was anything but ordinary. But those two words, those simple yet chilling words, had changed everything. What did he know? What truth was he revealing that had made even the judge tremble? The tension in the room grew thicker, suffocating. No one dared to speak, as if they were waiting for the storm to hit. Judge Reed's eyes darted around the room, her hand still trembling as she gripped the gavel. Dorian, standing there with the air of someone who had seen much more than a child his age should have, looked around calmly, his eyes scanning the faces of the courtroom. It wasn't just the judge who was affected by Dorian's words. The entire room was paralyzed, waiting for the next move. Everyone was asking themselves the same question. What did he know? The silence was finally broken when a uniformed officer entered the courtroom, his face grim. He whispered something into Judge Reed's ear. The moment she heard it, her eyes widened in disbelief. The officer's message was short, yet it carried the weight of years of hidden truth. The sealed case was real. There was no conspiracy. Everything Dorian had said was true. Judge Reed's face drained of all color as the room descended into chaos. Her career, her life's work, was now hanging by a thread. How could she have kept this hidden for so long? The prosecutor, who had always been confident, looked shaken, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The jurors exchanged nervous glances, unsure of what to believe. "How could you have kept this hidden?" one of the jurors whispered in disbelief. Judge Reed stood motionless, her world crumbling around her. Her authority, once unquestioned, was now shattered. Dorian remained calm, his eyes steady as he turned to face the courtroom. He had no intention of backing down. In this moment, he wasn't just a child from the shelter, he was a force of justice. As the chaos erupted in the courtroom, Dorian stepped forward. His small figure, clad in an oversized hoodie, seemed almost out of place in such a charged atmosphere. Yet in that moment, he exuded an undeniable sense of power. "The truth is out, Judge Reed." "There's nowhere left for you to hide," Dorian said, his voice steady, cutting through the noise like a sharp blade. The words hit the judge like a freight train. She stumbled back, struggling to maintain her composure. Her breath quickened, and for the first time in her career, she appeared truly vulnerable. Dorian's gaze never left her. His words, though few, had shattered the illusion of control that Judge Reed had so carefully maintained over the years. As the judge stood frozen, the atmosphere in the room grew heavier. Everyone in the courtroom could feel the shift. The power had shifted. The jurors exchanged uneasy glances. The prosecutor and defense attorney remained silent, both unsure of what to do next. The officers, standing at attention, were equally tense, unsure of how to react. Dorian knew this moment was pivotal. He wasn't just making a statement. He was tearing down a facade that had hidden corruption for years. As the silence stretched on, Dorian continued. "The sealed case, it's not a conspiracy. It's real, and now the world will know the truth." His words sent a shock wave through the courtroom. Judge Reed's face was ashen, her thoughts racing. Her career, her life's work, was unraveling before her eyes. The officer who had delivered the devastating news stood to the side, his eyes watching the unfolding scene with a mixture of concern and resignation. What is it? Judge Reed finally managed to whisper, her voice hoarse, as the officer stepped closer to her. The officer bent down, his words soft but clear. The sealed case is real, Judge. It's not a rumor. Everything you've hidden is about to come to light. Judge Reed staggered back, as if the weight of the truth had physically struck her. Her career, her reputation, everything she had built, was now collapsing. The courtroom was now in total disarray. Whispers filled the air as everyone tried to comprehend what had just been revealed. No one could believe what had just happened, and yet the truth was undeniable. Dorian, still standing at the center of the room, watched the chaos unfold around him. His face remained calm, but his eyes betrayed a deep sense of purpose. He had known this moment would come. "This is just the beginning," Dorian said, his voice cutting through the panic. "The system is broken, and it's time for the truth to rise to the surface." The prosecutor was the first to break the silence. He stepped forward, his face pale but his voice firm. "What do you know about the sealed case, boy?" he asked, his eyes narrow with suspicion. Dorian turned his gaze toward the prosecutor, unwavering. "I know everything," he replied, his tone measured but full of conviction. "And soon, so will everyone else." The prosecutor's eyes flickered with uncertainty. He knew Dorian wasn't just a random child from a shelter. There was something more to him, something much more dangerous. Judge Reed, still reeling from the blow, slowly straightened up. Her voice, once commanding, was now barely a whisper. "You're just a child. What could you possibly understand about this case?" Dorian stepped forward again, his eyes fixed on the judge. "Sometimes it takes a child to see the truth that adults cannot," he said softly, but there was a sharpness in his words. "I've seen enough to know that this system is corrupt, and no one is above the law." The courtroom fell silent once more, as everyone processed Dorian's words. The weight of his statement hung in the air, leaving an undeniable impression on everyone present. The officer who had delivered the news to Judge Reed stepped forward, his face stern. He nodded at Dorian. "You're right, the sealed case, it's real. We've been covering it up for years." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. Judge Reed's face twisted with disbelief, and for the first time, she seemed truly broken. Dorian's expression softened, but only slightly. "It's over, Judge," he said, his voice quiet but filled with finality. "You can't hide anymore." As the realization of the truth settled in, the room was filled with a strange mixture of shock, disbelief, and, for some, a sense of relief. The truth was no longer a secret. Judge Reed was escorted out of the courtroom, her face pale and broken. The officer who had confirmed the sealed case remained in the room, standing silently at attention. As the courtroom began to clear, the weight of what had just transpired settled over everyone. Dorian stood in the center, his eyes scanning the room, not looking for approval, but for something deeper, something that validated everything he had just done. He wasn't a child anymore. Not in this room, not in this moment. In this space, with the truth laid bare for all to see, Dorian had become something more, a symbol of resistance, a force that had toppled an entire system of corruption. The officer who had stood beside Judge Reed now approached Dorian, his expression softening. "I didn't believe it at first," he admitted, "but now I see. You were right." Dorian nodded, his gaze unwavering. "It wasn't just about proving I was right. It was about making sure the truth was heard. No one else would have done it. No one else had the courage." The officer looked at him for a moment longer, then nodded solemnly. "You've changed everything, kid. This will be remembered." Dorian turned away, his eyes scanning the now empty courtroom. He didn't need to hear the praise or the recognition. He knew what he had done, and he knew it wasn't over yet. The doors to the courtroom opened, and the first of the reporters began to filter in. They were hungry for the story, for the truth that had just been unearthed. They had been waiting for someone to break the silence, and Dorian had done just that. "Dorian, how did you know about the sealed case?" one reporter asked, his voice filled with urgency. "What made you speak out in front of everyone?" Dorian paused, his gaze thoughtful as he turned to face the press. He had expected this moment, but he wasn't interested in the attention. He was interested in something far bigger. "Sometimes the truth is the only thing that matters," he said quietly, his voice steady but carrying the weight of everything he had just been through. "It doesn't matter how old you are. If you know the truth, you have to speak it. That's the only way to change anything." The reporters were taken aback by his words, the gravity of his message sinking in. This wasn't just a story about exposing corruption. It was a call to action, a reminder that everyone had a role to play in upholding justice. Dorian turned and walked out of the courtroom, his head held high. He knew that the battle was far from over. There were still many secrets to uncover, many battles to fight, but for now he had made his mark, and the world would never be the same again. As Dorian walked out of the courtroom, the weight of the moment still pressed heavily on him. He had made history today, but he felt no sense of triumph, only the quiet realization that his journey was far from over. Outside, the world continued as if nothing had changed. Cars honked, people rushed by, and life went on. But Dorian knew better. He had seen too much to pretend that things were normal. His mind was racing. What came next? What would happen to the judge? To the people who had been complicit in the cover-up? Dorian knew the system wouldn't change overnight, but today had been a small victory, one that would eventually snowball into something much larger. He was approached by a young reporter as he exited the building. She was the same reporter who had asked him earlier in the courtroom. "Dorian," she said, holding up her microphone, "why did you do it? What made you stand up when no one else would?" Dorian paused for a moment before answering. He wasn't sure how to explain it, how to put into words the feeling that had been building inside him for so long. But he tried. "I've lived through enough to know that if we don't speak up, nothing changes," he said softly, his voice steady but filled with conviction. "The system only works for those in power. For everyone else, it's just a game. But I'm done being a pawn in that game." The reporter nodded, her eyes wide with respect. "You've just given us something bigger than a story, Dorian. You've given us a reason to hope." Dorian didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned and started walking down the street, his steps steady and purposeful. He wasn't interested in fame or recognition. The world had enough of that already. What mattered now was the work that still lay ahead. As Dorian disappeared into the crowd, the reporter watched him for a moment, then turned back to her camera crew. "Get this footage to the studio," she said. "This is the story that will change everything." The days that followed were filled with chaos. News outlets scrambled to cover the story, interviews with Dorian, and investigative reports on the sealed case flooded every channel. The public demanded answers, and the pressure on the authorities was immense. But Dorian didn't waver. He stayed focused on what he had to do, knowing that exposing one lie was just the first step in a much larger fight. He had set a fire that could not be easily put out. It wasn't long before other whistleblowers came forward, people who had been silenced by the same system Dorian had exposed. The floodgates had opened, and the truth was rushing out like a river breaking through a dam. The corrupt officials who had been hiding in the shadows were now scrambling to cover their tracks. But it was too late. The truth had a way of coming to light no matter how deep the lies had been buried. Dorian, the boy from the shelter, had not only changed the course of a trial, he had changed the course of an entire system. And though the battle was far from over, the seeds of change had already been planted.